Elizabeth Taylor was 18 years old on her wedding night, when her new husband kicked her so hard she lost their baby. Joan Collins was 17 when her idol drugged and assaulted her, then convinced her to marry him out of shame. And Lana Turner held a loaded weapon to her husband's head when she discovered what he'd been doing to her 10-year-old daughter for 3 years. And these are just 3 of the 24 documented stories that will shatter every fairy tale Hollywood ever sold you. Elizabeth Taylor and Nikki Hilton. May 6, 1950. 600 guests filled the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills to witness what the press called the wedding of the century. 18-year-old Elizabeth Taylor, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most precious jewel, walked down the aisle in a $3,500 gown. Her groom was Conrad Nicholson Hilton Jr., called Nicky, heir to the Hilton Hotel empire. He was 23, handsome, wealthy, and according to every magazine in America, the perfect match for the girl who had captured the nation as a child star. What the cameras didn't capture was the look in Elizabeth's violet eyes. Years later, she would confess that even as she spoke her vows, a small voice whispered that something was terribly wrong. But at 18, raised entirely within the studio system, she pushed that voice down and smiled for the photographers. The honeymoon was a 3-month tour of Europe that should have been a dream. Instead, it became a nightmare that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. Nikki began drinking on their wedding night and rarely stopped. By the time they reached Paris, the verbal abuse had started. He called her stupid, unsophisticated, a disappointment. When she tried to sleep, he would wake her to criticize her again. The physical violence began somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. He would disappear to gambling halls for days, leaving her alone in hotel rooms. When he returned, intoxicated and angry, he took his losses out on her body. She tried to hide the bruises under makeup and long sleeves, forcing smiles for the European press who mobbed them at every stop. But Elizabeth was hiding something the photographers couldn't see. She had discovered she was pregnant. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that a baby might change him. What happened next would haunt her forever. During one of his violent rages, Nikki kicked her in the stomach. Elizabeth lost the baby. She was 19 years old when she filed for divorce after just 205 days of marriage. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer offered her no protection, no acknowledgement that they had essentially handed their teenage star to a violent man because the photographs would sell tickets. Elizabeth survived, but the trauma never left her. In interviews decades later, she would speak about Nikki Hilton with sadness and anger, remembering the girl she had been so young, so trusting, so utterly unprepared for the monster hiding behind the tuxedo. Elizabeth escaped in months, but some young brides weren't so lucky, and sometimes the monster wasn't the husband at all. Lana Turner and Lex Barker. Lana Turner was one of the most glamorous women in Hollywood history. With her platinum blonde hair and undeniable screen presence, she embodied everything audiences loved about Golden Age cinema. But her fourth marriage was different. It wasn't just trouble, it was criminal. 1953. Lana married Lex Barker, the actor who had become famous playing Tarzan. Lana's daughter Cheryl, from an earlier marriage, was 10 years old. She served as flower girl at the wedding, smiling for the cameras. What no one knew, what wouldn't be revealed for 35 years, was that Cheryl was smiling while standing next to the man who would soon become her worst nightmare. Behind closed doors, Lex Barker began violating Cheryl. She was 10 years old when it started. He would come to her room at night, tell her that if she told anyone, she would be sent away to juvenile detention. He would hurt her, then threaten her, then hurt her again. For 3 years, Cheryl stayed silent. The fear of being blamed, of being taken from her mother, all of it, kept her quiet while the abuse continued. She was 13 years old when she finally found the courage to tell Lana what had been happening under her own roof. According to Cheryl's 1988 memoir, which became a New York Times bestseller, Lana's reaction was immediate. She held a weapon to Lex Barker's head while he slept, seriously considering whether to pull the trigger. Instead, she kicked him out the next morning. She took Cheryl to a doctor who confirmed what had been done to her. Lana divorced Barker in 1957, never publicly revealing the truth. Here's what happened next, and here's why it matters. Lex Barker went on to have a successful career in European cinema. He married twice more before his passing in 1973 at age 54. He never faced criminal charges. The studio's new whispers traveled through Hollywood, but no one stopped working with him. Cheryl Crane grew up knowing that her abuser was still a star. It wasn't until 1988 that she finally told the world what Lex Barker had done. By then, he had been gone for 15 years. Justice came only in the form of truth. If these hidden truths are shocking you, Subscribe to this channel. We're uncovering what the studios buried every single week. Lana at least believed her daughter and took action. Some young women in Hollywood had no one to protect them at all. Joan Collins and Maxwell Reid. Joan Collins was 17 years old in 1950 when she was invited to the apartment of Maxwell Reid for what she thought would be a casual dinner. Reid was 31, a successful British actor who had become one of Joan's idols. Reid answered the door in an elegant smoking jacket. He poured her a rum and coke. She took a sip. When Joan woke up hours later, disoriented and in pain, she knew something terrible had happened. But what Reid did next was even worse because the assault was just the beginning. What he would ask her to do 4 years later would finally give Joan the strength to escape. But first, she had to marry him. In a 2022 BBC documentary, Joan Collins spoke publicly for the first time about what happened that night. Reid had sedated her drink. While she was unconscious, he violated her. In those days, Joan said, my mother would have said I was taken advantage of. Now we call it date assault. Yet the horror didn't end there. Joan, raised in an era when a young woman's reputation was everything, believed she had no choice. When Maxwell Reid proposed marriage 2 years later, she said yes. She married her attacker in 1952, convinced that it was the only way to salvage her honor. For 4 years, Joan endured psychological abuse. Reid was controlling, manipulative, emotionally abusive. And then came the night that finally broke through Joan's paralysis. They were at Les Ambassadeurs, one of the most exclusive nightclubs in London's Mayfair district. That night, Reid leaned over and told her about a business proposition. An elderly gentleman wanted to spend the night with her. He was offering £10,000 a fortune at the time. Maxwell would even watch, if that's what the man preferred. Joan looked at her husband, and something inside her broke. Never in a million years, she told him. She went home to her mother. She filed for divorce. The divorce cost her millions, but she later said freedom was worth every penny. Maxwell Reid passed away in 1974 at age 55, having never acknowledged what he had done. Joan went on to become a global star, most famously as Alexis Carrington in Dynasty, but she carried those scars for decades, unable to speak about them until she was an old woman. Joan was 17 when it started. Yet Hollywood's youngest victim was even more vulnerable, and her abuser was one of the most beloved men in cinema history, Charlie Chaplin and Lita Grey. Lita Grey was 15 years old when she met Charles Chaplin. She was working as an extra on one of his films. Chaplin was 35, the biggest star in the world, the little tramp who made millions laugh. When he paid attention to young Lita, she was flattered. When he seduced her, she was too naive to understand she was being manipulated. When Lita discovered she was pregnant at age 16, Chaplin had a choice. He could face statutory charges for impregnating a minor, or he could marry her. They were wed in a rushed ceremony in Mexico in November 1924, with Chaplin's lawyers frantically working to protect him from prosecution. The wedding was not a beginning. It was a trap closing around a child. Lita gave birth to their first son when she was just 17. She would have 2 children with Chaplin before she turned 20, and for all those years, she endured his cruelty, his infidelity, his contempt. Chaplin never loved her. He made that abundantly clear. He called her stupid, worthless, a mistake. He flaunted his affairs. He made demands on her body that she later described as disturbing and degrading. In January 1927, Lita Grey fought back. She filed for divorce, and the complaint was 42 pages long. 42 pages detailing years of mental cruelty, infidelity, and inappropriate demands. Newspapers across the country published excerpts. Theaters threatened to stop showing his films. The public was horrified. Yet Chaplin was too big to fail. The studios rallied around him. Eventually, Lita settled for a financial payment, and Chaplin's career survived. He went on to make more films, to continue being celebrated as a genius. Lita spent the rest of her life trying to recover from what had been done to her when she was still a child. The 42-page divorce complaint still exists in court records, a testament to what really happened behind Chaplin's public persona. Chaplin's power protected him from consequences. Yet when jealousy turned violent, the results could be even more dramatic and sometimes literally explosive. Joan Bennett and Walter Wanger. December 13, 1951. The parking lot behind the Music Corporation of America offices in Beverly Hills. It was just after 6 in the evening. Joan Bennett, one of Hollywood's most elegant leading ladies, sat in her Cadillac convertible after a meeting with her agent, Jennings Lang. What Joan didn't know was that her husband, producer Walter Wanger, had been waiting in his car for hours. He had hired private investigators. He knew about Joan's meetings with Lang, and on this December evening, Walter Wanger decided he had waited long enough. As Jennings Lang walked Joan to her car, Walter Wanger stepped out of the shadows. He raised his weapon and fired twice. One bullet struck Lang in the right thigh. The other hit him in the groin. Joan screamed. Lang collapsed. When the police arrived, Walter's statement was simple. "I shot him because I thought he was breaking up my home." Walter Wanger was arrested and charged with assault with a dangerous weapon. At his trial, a parade of Hollywood's elite testified to Walter's good character. The judge sentenced him to 4 months at the county honor farm. 4 months for shooting a man twice. Joan Bennett had no idea her life was over. As Jennings Lang was rushed to the hospital and Walter was led away, Joan thought the nightmare was ending. She was wrong. Because in Hollywood's twisted moral universe, the woman who got shot was about to become more hated than the man who pulled the trigger. Jennings Lang survived and went on to become a major producer. He passed away in 1996, having lived a full life. Walter Wanger served his time and returned to producing films. He later produced Cleopatra. He passed away in 1968, respected and successful. Yet Joan Bennett's career never recovered. She became the villain of the story. Before the shooting, she had made 65 films in 23 years. In the decade after, she made only 5. Doors closed, offers dried up. She was blacklisted by the industry's silent agreement that she had somehow pulled the trigger herself. Joan stayed married to Walter until 1965, perhaps trapped by financial necessity. When she finally divorced him, she moved to New York and eventually found success on Dark Shadows. But the film career she had spent decades building was gone. Violence in Golden Age Hollywood wasn't always a weapon in a parking lot. Sometimes it was quieter, more personal, and sometimes the children caught in the crossfire paid the highest price. Bette Davis and Gary Merrill. The police were called to Bette Davis's Maine home 17 times in a single year. Neighbors reported hearing glass shatter and screaming matches that lasted until dawn. When officers arrived, they found Hollywood's most legendary actress standing with blood on her hands, while her husband Gary Merrill sat in the corner with a black eye, refusing to press charges. What the world didn't know was that both of them were destroying each other, night after night, with their adopted children watching from the stairs. Bette Davis and Gary Merrill met on the set of All About Eve in 1949. On set, Bette, already a legend, and Gary, a talented character actor, fell hard for each other. They married in 1950, adopted 2 children, and settled into what looked like domestic bliss. Behind closed doors, their home was anything but blissful. Both had volcanic temperaments. Both drank heavily. And when they fought, which was often, they fought with the intensity of 2 actors who knew exactly how to devastate each other. Objects flew through the air, dishes, books, anything within reach. The police were called to break up domestic disputes. The children witnessed it all. For 10 years, Bette and Gary tore each other apart while their children learned that love looked like broken glass and raised voices. When they finally divorced in 1960, both spent years publicly trashing each other. Bette called Gary a drunk and a disappointment. Gary called Bette impossible, cruel, a nightmare to live with. The children paid the price. B.D. Hyman, Betty's daughter, would eventually write a scathing memoir about her mother. Growing up in the Davis-Merrill household left scars that never healed. Bette and Gary were equals in their destruction. However, some marriages had a clear victim and a clear villain, and sometimes the villain's weapon was invisible until it was too late. Veronica Lake and Andre DeToth. In 1962, a reporter walked into a Manhattan hotel bar and saw a woman who looked vaguely familiar working as a cocktail waitress. When he got closer, he realized he was looking at Veronica Lake, the peekaboo girl who'd been one of Hollywood's biggest stars just 10 years earlier. She was living under a fake name, broke, working for tips. How does a woman go from being so famous the government asked her to change her hairstyle to serving drinks to strangers who don't recognize her? The answer started with a man who secretly destroyed her career while pretending to love her. Veronica Lake was the girl with the peekaboo hair, one of Hollywood's most iconic images of the 1940s. That cascading blonde wave became her trademark, copied by women across America until the War Department asked her to change it because factory workers kept getting their hair caught in machinery. However, By 1944, when Veronica married film director DeToth, her career was already declining. DeToth was known as a talented director with a tough reputation. He was also, according to multiple sources, violent. The marriage produced 2 children, Andre Jr. and Diana. It also produced financial ruin, career sabotage, and mutual destruction through alcohol. Both drank heavily, yet Andre controlled Veronica's career in ways she didn't understand until it was too late. Scripts would come in for Veronica. Good scripts, roles that could have kept her career afloat. Andre, without telling his wife, would turn them down. He was out of work himself and apparently couldn't bear the thought of his wife succeeding while he struggled. So he sabotaged her, quietly, systematically, until the offers stopped coming. By 1951, they had both filed for bankruptcy. The Ayres seized their home. Veronica, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, took their children and fled to New York. In 1952, their divorce became final. Andre DeToth went on to have a successful career directing films like House of Wax. He remarried, worked steadily, and passed away in 2002 at age 90. Veronica Leigh descended into alcoholism and poverty. She passed away in 1973 at age 50 from acute hepatitis and kidney failure. She was 50 years old, broke, largely forgotten, attended by almost no one at her memorial service. Veronica Leigh passed away alone, destroyed by a man's jealousy. However, her husband's weapon was silent rejection. Rita Hayworth's husband used something far more symbolic. He took the one thing the world loved most about her and cut it off with scissors while she watched in the mirror, helpless to stop him. Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles. Rita Hayworth was born Margarita Carmen Cancino, the daughter of Spanish dancers. She was transformed by Hollywood into Rita Hayworth, an American goddess with auburn hair that made her the #1 pinup girl for servicemen during World War II. In 1943, she thought she had found love in Orson Welles. Welles was 28, already famous for his War of the Worlds broadcast in Citizen Kane. Rita was 25, and at the height of her fame, they married in September, and their daughter Rebecca was born in December of the following year. Yet Orson had not fallen in love with Rita. He had fallen in love with the idea of Rita Hayworth, the fantasy. The real woman, vulnerable, insecure, desperate for stability, bored him. He told her so, repeatedly. He would disappear for days, leaving her alone with a baby. When he was home, he criticized her intelligence, her interests, her hopes. The most symbolic act of control came when Orson convinced Rita to let him cut and bleach her famous red hair for his film The Lady from Shanghai. That cascade of auburn silk was chopped into a short platinum blonde bob. The film was a commercial failure, and audiences were shocked and disappointed. Many saw it as Orson's revenge, his way of punishing Rita for being real instead of the fantasy he wanted. Orson Welles wanted to reshape Rita Hayworth into something that suited him better, even if it meant destroying what made her special. They separated in 1946. In 1947, Rita filed for divorce, stating that Orson showed no interest in establishing a home, and had told her he never should have married in the first place, as it interfered with his freedom. Later in life, Rita would tell Orson that the only happiness she had ever known had been with him. His response was devastating. If this was happiness, imagine what the rest of her life had been. Rita married 5 times. None brought her peace. In her later years, she developed Alzheimer's disease. She passed away in 1987 at age 68. Her final years marked by the cruel erosion of her memory and identity. Orson Welles passed away in 1985 at age 70, still regarded as a genius. The woman whose hair he cut, whose heart he broke, became a footnote in his story. Control came in many forms. Sometimes it was cutting a woman's hair, sometimes it was cutting her down emotionally, and sometimes the woman doing the cutting was the most powerful person in Hollywood, Joan Crawford and Franchot. Joan Crawford was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She had clawed her way up from poverty, reinvented herself multiple times, won an Oscar, and become a legend. She was also a woman who needed to dominate every relationship. Franchot was everything Joan was not. He came from money, from an educated East Coast family. He had trained in theater and had a culture that Joan felt she lacked. When they married in 1935, it seemed like the perfect match. Yet Joan couldn't bear not being in control. She monitored Franchot's friendships, his career choices, and his every move. She was jealous of his theater background. She made him feel small, inadequate, and lesser. And Franchot turned to alcohol, The fights became legendary. Joan's need to dominate clashed with Franchot's growing resentment. In 1939, after 4 years of marriage, they divorced bitterly. Joan went on to marry 3 more times. Franchot's career never recovered. The drinking problem that had started during their marriage followed him for the rest of his life. Joan Crawford, who had fought so hard to have power in an industry that tried to take it from women, didn't know how to wield that power without destroying the people closest to her. Joan and Franchot were adults when they married. However, some of Hollywood's youngest stars learned about betrayal before they were old enough to understand it. Ava Gardner and Mickey Rooney. Ava Gardner was 19 years old when she married Mickey Rooney in 1942. Mickey was 21, but in Hollywood terms, he was ancient. He had been a star since childhood, the biggest box office draw in America. He was the Andy Hardy who charmed audiences. Ava was a North Carolina farm girl discovered by someone who saw her photograph in a store window. She was stunningly beautiful but still naive. When Mickey Rooney paid attention to her, she was overwhelmed. The marriage lasted less than a year. Within weeks, Ava discovered that Mickey's wholesome image was a complete fabrication. He was cheating on her constantly, sometimes with multiple women in the same day. Friends tried to warn her. They'd see Mickey at the Brown Derby with a blonde, at Ciro's with a brunette. When Ava confronted him, Mickey would laugh and tell her she was lucky to be Mrs. Mickey Rooney, as if his name was worth the humiliation of reading in gossip columns about his latest conquest. The worst part wasn't the cheating, it was cruel. Mickey would tell Ava about the other women deliberately, watching her face as he described them, enjoying the power of making her hurt. In 1943, their divorce became final. Yet that painful year taught Ava something crucial. She learned not to trust the image, not to let any man make her feel small or unworthy. She went on to become one of the greatest stars of her generation. Here's what the fan magazines never told you. While Mickey Rooney charmed America, studio executives knew exactly what he was doing. They covered for him because he made them millions. Mickey married 8 times total and treated every wife exactly the same way. He passed away in 2014 at age 93, having never once apologized. Ava's next great love would be Frank Sinatra, and that relationship would be just as passionate and just as destructive, but at least it would be between 2 equals. Young marriages taught brutal lessons. However, some of Hollywood's most celebrated couples were hiding even darker truths, and when mental illness entered the picture, love became a battleground no one could win. Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier. Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier were 2 of the greatest actors of the 20th century. Vivien was Scarlett O'Hara. Laurence was the definitive Shakespearean actor of his generation. When they fell in love in the late 1930s, they were both married to other people. Their passion was too intense to be denied. They divorced their respective spouses and married each other in August 1940, with Katharine Hepburn serving as a witness. For a while, they were the golden couple of theater and film. They made films together, performed Shakespeare together, lived at their estate Notley Abbey like British royalty. Yet behind the elegant facade, something was terribly wrong. Vivien suffered from what would now be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. In the 1940s and 50s, her episodes were terrifying. She would swing from manic highs to crushing lows where she could barely function. Olivier later described her illness as an uncannily evil monster that would possess his wife. In her manic phases, she had affairs with co-stars, including Peter Finch and Marlon Brando. Olivier had his own affairs, including with actress Joan Plowright. In 1948, during a tour of Australia and New Zealand, their marriage reached a violent crisis point. In Christchurch, a fight erupted that ended with Olivier striking Vivien across the face. She struck him back. It was the moment when whatever love had held them together began to shatter. Vivien's mental state continued to deteriorate. She lost a baby to miscarriage, which sent her into a depression that lasted months. Olivier, overwhelmed, began spending more time with Joan Plowright. The cruelest part came at the end. In March 1960, while Vivien was in New York preparing to open in a play, she received a telegram from Olivier. Not a phone call, a telegram. He wanted a divorce. He wanted to marry Joan Plowright. Vivien was devastated. Friends said she never recovered from that telegram. In December 1960, their divorce became final. Olivier married Plowright in 1961, and they stayed together until his passing in 1989. Vivien Leigh passed away on July 7, 1967, at age 53. She had been suffering from tuberculosis. She was found in her London flat by her partner Jack Merrill. Olivier, himself hospitalized, discharged himself when he heard the news and went to her apartment. He stood over her body and, according to his later writings, prayed for forgiveness for all the evils that had sprung up between us. Yet forgiveness was complicated by the fact that Olivier had abandoned a mentally ill woman, divorced her by telegram while she was vulnerable, and moved on to a younger woman. Vivien Leigh was one of the greatest actresses who ever lived, and she passed away alone, destroyed by an illness neither she nor he understood. Mental illness exposed the fragility of even the most celebrated marriages. However, some relationships were doomed by choices so shocking that Hollywood is still talking about them, and this next story involves a betrayal so unthinkable that, when discovered, it ended a marriage in a single afternoon. Gloria Grahame and Nicholas Ray. Gloria Grahame was born Gloria Hayworth in 1923. She became one of the greatest femme fatales of film noir, winning an Academy Award in 1952 for The Bad and the Beautiful. In 1948, she was filming A Woman's Secret when she began an affair with the director, Nicholas Ray. He later admitted, "I was infatuated with her, but I didn't like her very much." Gloria was still married when she became pregnant with Ray's child. She rushed to Las Vegas for a quickie divorce and married Ray on the same day, June 1, 1948. Their son Timothy was born 5 months later. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. Ray admitted he spent most of his time gambling so he wouldn't have any money for Gloria to claim. When they made In a Lonely Place together in 1950, the studio forced Gloria to sign a contract stating that Ray had complete control over her on set. Gloria hated it. However, she signed because she needed the work. For 3 more years, the marriage limped along. And then, in June 1951, everything exploded. Nicholas Ray came home to their Malibu house and found Gloria in bed with his son. Not a son from their marriage, Tony Ray, his 13-year-old son from his first marriage. The marriage ended immediately. Ray and Grahame divorced in 1952. The scandal was enormous, but it was quickly hushed up. Yet the story didn't end there. In 1960, 8 years after the divorce, Gloria Grahame married Tony Ray. He was 23, she was 37. They had 2 children together, and the marriage lasted 14 years. Gloria herself tried to shrug it off, saying, "People yawned when I married Nicholas Ray. Later I married his son, and people acted like I was committing illegal acts or robbing the cradle." Gloria Grahame passed away in 1981 at age 57 from stomach cancer. She had been married 4 times. According to those who knew her, all 4 husbands had been physically abusive. Nicholas Ray passed away in 1979 at age 67. He was remembered as a brilliant director whose personal life was a disaster. Scandal could end careers or, in Hollywood's twisted logic, barely register. However, when 2 massive stars collided in a relationship fueled by equal parts passion and rage, the whole world paid attention. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner were, in many ways, perfect for each other. Both were stunningly talented. Both were beautiful. Both had volcanic temperaments. The problem was that 2 explosive people couldn't be in the same room without something catching fire. They began their affair in 1949, while Frank was still married to his first wife, Nancy. Ava was married to her second husband, Artie Shaw. Neither marriage mattered once Frank and Ava locked eyes. Frank divorced Nancy, breaking her heart and enraging his fans. Ava divorced Shaw. Frank and Ava married in November 1951, convinced that marriage would somehow tame the intensity. It didn't. They fought constantly, screaming matches that could be heard through hotel walls, physical altercations that left both bruised, plates and glasses thrown with the accuracy of 2 people who had perfected the art of hurting each other. The jealousy was mutual and consuming. Frank would rage if Ava even looked at another man. Ava would flirt deliberately just to provoke him. Friends described their relationship as simultaneously the most passionate and the most toxic they had ever witnessed. In 1953, Ava became pregnant. She was filming Mogambo in Africa, and according to some accounts, she terminated the pregnancy, knowing that a child would trap her in a marriage that was destroying them both. They separated in 1954 and divorced in 1957, yet even divorce didn't end it. They stayed in contact, still fighting, still making up, still unable to fully let go. Ava once said that Frank was the love of her life. Frank said the same about her. Ava Gardner passed away in 1990 at age 67, having never remarried. Frank Sinatra passed away in 1998 at age 82. having married twice more but never with the same intensity. Which of these stories has affected you the most? And what other dark Hollywood secrets should we uncover? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. However, they were equals in the destruction. Some marriages were one-sided cruelty, and the cruelest weapon was sometimes just words. Tallulah Bankhead and John Emery. When Tallulah Bankhead introduced her husband at a dinner party, she said, "This is John Emery. He's my biggest mistake." John was standing right there. He laughed awkwardly, while everyone else looked at their plates in horror. This wasn't a joke gone wrong. This was a typical Tuesday night in their marriage. Tallulah Bankhead was one of the most outrageous personalities in Hollywood history. Bisexual, brilliant, with a voice like whiskey and sandpaper, she said what she thought and never apologized. She was also deeply cruel to the men she married. In 1937, she married actor John Emery in what can only be described as a whim. She barely knew him. She didn't respect him. However, she was feeling romantic, and John was handsome. For 4 years, Tallulah made it clear that she regretted her decision. She mocked John in public, flaunted her affairs while expecting him to sit quietly and accept the humiliation. Friends who witnessed their interactions were uncomfortable with how openly Tallulah emasculated her husband. She would cut him off mid-sentence. She would introduce him as, "my mistake." She treated the marriage as a joke and John as the punchline. In 1941, their divorce became final. Tallulah's only comment was brutal. The only good thing about that marriage was the divorce. John Emery went on to marry twice more. He worked steadily until his passing in 1975. Tallulah never married again. She passed away in 1968 at age 66, having lived exactly as she pleased but leaving behind a trail of people she had wounded. Public humiliation was a weapon some wielded with precision. However, national scandal could be even more effective, and when war came to America, one woman had to choose between her husband's conscience and her career: Ginger Rogers and Lou Ayres. Ginger Rogers was America's dancing queen, the woman who could do everything Fred Astaire could do, but backwards and in heels. So when her husband became one of the most controversial men in America overnight, she had a choice to make. Ginger married actor Lou Ayres in 1934. He was a sensitive, thoughtful man. They had been married for 7 years when the world changed on December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked. America entered World War II, and Lou Ayres announced that he was a conscientious objector. He would serve as a medic, but he would not harm another person. The reaction was immediate and vicious. Theaters refused to show his films. Newspapers called him a coward. Threats arrived. And Ginger Rogers found herself married to America's most hated man. She could have stood by him. Instead, she filed for divorce in 1941, citing his conscientious objector status as irreconcilable differences. She made public statements suggesting that his stance was cowardly. Lou Ayres did serve in the war, as a medic in the Pacific Theater. He saw combat, earned medals for bravery, and proved that conscience and courage are not opposites. After the war, his career slowly recovered. He married twice more and worked steadily until his passing in 1996. Ginger Rogers married 4 more times. None lasted long. She passed away in 1995 at age 83. However, she never acknowledged that she might have been wrong about Lou Ayres. Conscience destroyed that marriage. However, ego would destroy others, and sometimes the trigger was as simple as winning an award your husband thought should have been his. Joan Fontaine and Brian Aherne. Joan Fontaine won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1942 for Suspicion. It should have been one of the happiest moments of her life. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end of her marriage to Brian Aherne, because Brian couldn't forgive his wife for succeeding where he had failed. Joan and Brian had married in 1939. He was an established British actor, sophisticated and respected. When they married, his career was arguably more prestigious. He was comfortable with that dynamic. Then Joan was cast in Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion opposite Cary Grant. The film was a massive hit, and when the Academy Award nominations were announced, Joan was nominated while Brian was not. She won, and Brian Aherne could not handle it. The marriage became a battlefield of passive aggression. Brian made snide comments about Joan's ambition. He suggested that she was cold, calculating, too focused on her career. In 1945, their divorce became final. In interviews afterward, Brian continued to make bitter comments about Joan's coldness and ambition, as if her success was a personal attack. Joan Fontaine went on to be nominated for 2 more Academy Awards. She worked steadily for decades and maintained her dignity. She passed away in 2013 at age 96, having outlived all her critics. Male ego destroys many marriages. However, financial manipulation destroyed others, and sometimes the man who promised to love you was actually planning to steal everything you'd earned. Gloria Swanson and Herbert Somborn. Gloria Swanson was one of the biggest stars of the silent film era. Her face was known around the world, and in 1919, at the height of her fame, she married Herbert Somborn, a successful restaurateur. Somborn saw opportunity in his marriage to Gloria. He positioned himself as her business manager, taking control of her finances, her contracts, her earnings. However, as the years went on, Gloria realized that Herbert was more interested in her money than in her. He made financial decisions without consulting her. He pressured her to transfer property into his name. In 1922, their divorce became bitter and prolonged, with years of legal battles over money that Gloria had earned. Herbert Somborn eventually went on to found the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood, using the connections and capital he had gained during his marriage to Gloria. Gloria Swanson continued her career, transitioning successfully from silent films to talkies, giving one of cinema's most iconic performances in Sunset Boulevard in 1950. She married 5 more times and passed away in 1983 at age 84. However, the lesson stayed with her. Trust had to be earned, and even husbands could be predators when enough money was involved. Financial abuse was a quiet violence. However, when Hollywood royalty fell apart, the world paid attention, and the fairy tale castle they'd built became a prison neither could escape. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were the first true power couple in Hollywood history. When they married in March 1920, they became instant royalty. Their estate was called Pickfair, and getting invited there meant you'd made it in Hollywood. However, what the world saw, the parties, the glamour, was a carefully constructed lie. Because Mary was drinking, and Douglas was pathologically jealous. And behind Pickfair's gates, America's sweethearts were destroying each other. They founded United Artists together with Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith, revolutionizing how actors controlled their own work. However, by the late 1920s, perfection was a facade. Douglas was convinced that Mary was having affairs even when she wasn't. Mary, dealing with her mother's passing, had started drinking heavily. Both of their careers were struggling with the transition to talkies. Douglas would accuse Mary of flirting. Mary, hurt and angry, would actually flirt just to punish him. Douglas had affairs of his own. Mary began seeing a co-star. They separated in December 1933, after 13 years of marriage. When their divorce became final in 1936, the headlines were enormous. Hollywood's golden couple had fallen. Douglas married Sylvia Ashley almost immediately. He passed away in 1939 at age 56, reportedly regretting the divorce. Mary married actor Buddy Rogers. She lived until 1979, but her later years were marked by alcoholism and reclusiveness. She rarely left Pickfair, the mansion that had become a monument to a lost dream. If this journey has opened your eyes, like this video and share it. These stories deserve to be told. That fairy tale taught Hollywood that even the most perfect couples could implode. However, perhaps the most complicated relationship of all was one that defied easy categorization, and the truth behind Hollywood's greatest love story is more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy never married. They couldn't. Spencer was already married, a Catholic who refused to divorce his wife Louise. However, from the moment they met on the set of Woman of the Year in 1942 until Spencer's passing in 1967, they were together. 26 years, and a private relationship that Kate herself called absolute bliss. Yet was it? The facts paint a more complicated picture. Spencer Tracy was an alcoholic. His rages were legendary. He would disappear on drinking binges that lasted days. When he was home, he could be cruel, mocking her intelligence, her independence. He had affairs, most famously with Ingrid Bergman, but with others. Kate knew. She stayed anyway. For 26 years, Kate Hepburn lived her life around Spencer Tracy's schedule, his needs, his career. She never married him. She never had children. She was never publicly acknowledged as his partner. When he died of a heart attack on June 10, 1967, she wasn't at his funeral. His wife Louise was the official widow. In the years after Spencer's passing, Kate spoke about their relationship with deep love. She said it was the happiest time of her life. She said she wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe it was. Kate Hepburn was nobody's fool. If she said she was happy, who are we to argue? However, it's also true that for 26 years, one of Hollywood's most independent women made herself smaller to fit into a man's life. A man who gave her love, but also pain. A man who never chose her publicly, never made her his priority in the way she made him hers. Yet here's what Kate never said publicly, what only came out in private letters. Spencer Tracy never left his wife Louise because Louise had leverage. Their son John was born deaf, and Spencer feared that if he divorced Louise, she would claim he abandoned a disabled child career ending in Catholic Hollywood. Kate knew this. She knew she was playing second fiddle not to love, not to faith, but to public relations. And she chose to stay anyway. Chose to call it absolute bliss. Chose to defend a man who'd chosen his image over her happiness. Was it love? Yes. Was it also a cage Kate built for herself with full awareness? Also yes. Katharine Hepburn passed away in 2003 at age 96, having outlived Spencer by 36 years. In all that time, she never spoke ill of him. She defended their love story until the end. Perhaps that's the most complicated truth of all. Not every toxic relationship looks toxic from the inside. Not every sacrifice feels like a loss. Sometimes love is messy and complicated and unfair. And sometimes the person holding you hostage is yourself. Sometimes the person holding you hostage is yourself. However, other times, the prison was built by a man who claimed to be saving you, and the bars were made of medication, manipulation, and a contract that gave him control over everything, including your sanity. Frances Farmer and Harry York. Frances Farmer was brilliant. Not Hollywood brilliant, actually brilliant. She had won scholarships, written essays that challenged authority, questioned religion and capitalism in 1930s America, when that could ruin you. She was also stunningly beautiful, which meant Hollywood wanted her even though they had no idea what to do with a woman who refused to play the game. In 1943, Frances married Harry York, a man she barely knew. She was desperate, broken, and recently released from psychiatric hospitalization. Harry presented himself as her protector, someone who would help her rebuild her shattered career and life. What Frances didn't know was that Harry saw opportunity. He positioned himself as her manager, her caretaker, her decision-maker. He controlled her money, her career opportunities, and according to multiple sources, used her psychiatric history as a weapon. When Frances disagreed with Harry's decisions, he would threaten to have her committed again. The fear of being sent back to the psychiatric institutions where she had endured treatments that were closer to harsh punishment than medicine kept her compliant. Harry knew exactly which threat would break her. The marriage lasted less than 2 years, ending in 1945. However, the damage lasted far longer. Frances's career never recovered. The psychiatric hospitalizations had destroyed her reputation. The treatments had damaged her memory and spirit. Harry York disappeared into obscurity after their divorce. Frances Farmer spent years in and out of institutions, subjected to treatments including insulin shock therapy. By the time she was finally released for good in 1950, Hollywood had completely forgotten her. Frances worked as a hotel clerk, a factory worker, anything to survive. She eventually found work in television in the 1950s and wrote an autobiography. She passed away in 1970 at age 56 from esophageal cancer. The tragedy wasn't just what happened to Frances Farmer. It was that Harry York represented a particular kind of predator, the one who finds vulnerable women and uses their trauma, their desperation, their fear as tools of control. He didn't need to raise his fist. The threat of institutionalization was enough. Control through fear of commitment was psychological warfare. However, when substance abuse became the third person in a marriage, even genuine love couldn't survive the destruction that followed. Deanna Durbin and Vaughn Paul. Deanna Durbin was America's sweetheart in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Her singing voice and wholesome image quite literally saved Universal Studios from bankruptcy. At 14, she was more bankable than most adult stars. By 21, she was one of the highest-paid women in America. In 1945, at age 24, Deanna married Vaughn Paul, a film director. She was already showing signs of exhaustion from the relentless studio system, already questioning whether she wanted to continue in Hollywood. Vaughn seemed to represent an escape, someone who understood the industry but could help her find a different path. However, Vaughn had demons Deanna hadn't seen during their courtship. He drank heavily and when he drank, he became someone else entirely. The verbal abuse started within months of the wedding. He would tear into Deanna's insecurities, her weight, her intelligence, her worth beyond her famous face. The worst part was the isolation. Vaughn encouraged Deanna to retreat from Hollywood, which aligned with her own desires to escape the spotlight. However, once they were isolated together, she had no support system, no studio handlers, no friends from the industry, no family nearby. Just Vaughn, the alcohol, and his increasingly cruel behavior. Deanna later described feeling trapped between two impossible choices: return to the Hollywood machine she hated, or stay in a marriage that was destroying her in different ways. They divorced in 1949 after 4 years of marriage. Deanna would marry once more, a happy marriage that lasted until her passing. However, the Vaughn-Paul years had accelerated her decision to leave Hollywood entirely. In 1949, at age 27, Deanna Durbin made her final film and walked away from Hollywood forever. She moved to France, refused all interviews, declined all offers to return, and lived a private life until her passing in 2013 at age 91. The studio that she had saved never publicly acknowledged what the pressure had done to her. The husband who had isolated her never apologized. And Deanna Durbin, who had brought joy to millions during the Depression and World War II, spent the last 64 years of her life ensuring that Hollywood could never touch her again. Sometimes walking away is the only form of survival. However, for the next woman, walking away wasn't an option because her husband had made sure that she was financially dependent on him, legally bound to him, and isolated from everyone who might have helped her escape. Gene Tierney and Oleg Cassini. Gene Tierney had one of the most beautiful faces in cinema history. Her role in Laura made her a star, and her ethereal beauty made her unforgettable. In 1941, at age 21, she married Oleg Cassini, a fashion designer who was charming, sophisticated, and controlling in ways Gene didn't recognize until it was too late. Oleg wanted a wife who would be a beautiful accessory to his career. He encouraged Gene to dress perfectly, to attend the right parties, to be seen with the right people. However, he discouraged her from having close friendships, from making decisions without consulting him, from having any life that didn't revolve around his needs and ambitions. The marriage became more complicated when their daughter Daria was born in 1943 with severe developmental disabilities. Instead of bringing them together, Daria's condition became another tool of control. Oleg made all decisions about Daria's care, often overruling Gene's maternal instincts. He insisted on institutionalizing Daria when Gene wanted to keep her at home. Gene later suffered a mental breakdown in 1953, partly from the guilt of having Daria in an institution, partly from years of having her autonomy stripped away. She was hospitalized for depression and underwent electroshock therapy. During Gene's hospitalization, Oleg began an affair. Gene discovered it when she returned home. They divorced in 1952, ending 11 years of marriage. The cruelest irony is that Oleg Cassini went on to tremendous success. He became Jackie Kennedy's personal designer, achieved fame and wealth, and passed away in 2006 at age 92, celebrated and successful. Gene Tierney never fully recovered. She married once more, briefly and unhappily. Her career suffered. The mental health treatments of the era damaged her in ways that modern medicine would recognize as tragic and unnecessary. She passed away in 1991 at age 70, having spent decades trying to rebuild what years of control and manipulation had broken. Gene Tierney's beauty made her famous. However, that same beauty made her a target for a man who wanted a perfect doll, not a partner. And when the doll broke under the pressure, he simply moved on to his next project. These 21 couples remind us that Hollywood's golden age was never as golden as it looked. Behind every perfect photograph was a complicated human story. The couples we've explored today span the full range of human cruelty: violating a child, date assault and forced marriage, physical violence and psychological abuse, financial manipulation and career sabotage, jealousy, addiction, mental illness, and the crushing weight of fame. However, these stories also remind us of something important: survival. Elizabeth Taylor survived Nikki Hilton and went on to become one of the greatest stars in history. Joan Collins survived Maxwell Reed and became an icon. Ava Gardner learned from Mickey Rooney's betrayal and became the woman who wouldn't be controlled. The survivors deserve to be remembered not just for what was done to them, but for what they did afterward, for the careers they built, the boundaries they set, the strength they found. If you've made it this far, Thank you for taking this journey through Hollywood's darkest marriages. These stories matter because they remind us that fame and beauty don't protect anyone from pain. That the images we see are carefully constructed. That the real people behind those images deserve our compassion and respect. If you want to see more stories like this, the hidden truths, the buried secrets, the real people behind Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're committed to telling these stories with honesty and respect. And if there's a specific golden age Hollywood topic you'd like us to explore next, let us know in the comments. We read every suggestion, and many of our best stories come directly from you. Until next time, remember that behind every legend is a human being. Behind every fairy tale is a complicated truth, and behind every perfect photograph is a story worth telling.